Okay, I guess you have seen that our guest speaker here for tonight has arrived, so I'm glad he's here. My name is Brett Nillis. I'm the current chair for Linn County Democrats, and I'm really glad you're here. From the standpoint of the more bodies we get in here, the warmer it gets, so that's good. But then also, I think it shows the enthusiasm that is taking place within our community, within the state of Iowa, in terms of we need a change in our current administration. Today I get to introduce the mayor, Pete Buttigieg. And what he has to offer us. I don't know if many of you know much about his background. He's current mayor of South Bend, Indiana. Served in the military. Went to Harvard, Rhodes Scholar. But the biggest thing that I picked up was watching Morning Joe last week when he was talking in terms of executive experience. This gentleman has more executive experience within the government than Mr. Pence and Donald Trump. And he's got more military experience than both of them put together. That was a direct quote, so I can't claim credit for that. But I don't want to take up much more of your time because I really want you to hear from the mayor, Pete Buttigieg.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction, first of all, and thanks for coming out on a chilly day. I appreciate you making me feel at home by arranging the brisk weather. And if you have trouble with Buttigieg, feel free to just call me Pete, or Mayor Pete's what they call me back home. Let me share a little bit about what we're up to, and then we'll use some time, I hope, for some question and answers before we just visit one-on-one. But it's fair game to ask why somebody who is a mayor in his 30s from a city not that different in size than Cedar Rapids would be trying to enter a conversation about the highest office of the land in 2020 at a moment when the stakes around that office are even higher than they usually are. But I guess I'm here to make the case that a millennial Midwestern mayor might be exactly what we need at a moment when what we've been doing isn't working. I come from a community that's not so different than this, a river city, a city with a great industrial heritage, and a city that's really been experiencing a lot of the ups and downs of profound changes that are happening to our economy, to our society, to our government, to our climate, and finding ways to move forward in the context of that kind of change. And I actually would argue that a mayor is unusually well positioned to address some of these issues compared to some of the traditional backgrounds that in the past we've looked at to be table stakes to me in this conversation. So I mean no disrespect to the United States Congress, but I would argue that we'd be better off if Washington started looking more like the best run cities and towns in America instead of the other way around. At a moment when we see often paralysis and cynicism, especially in today's White House, I would argue that we could look to the way that our best cities are run. We could look to local leadership and see, for example, what happens when you're at a level of government where it is flatly out of the question that you would shut it down over an ideological disagreement for the simple reason that we deliver water and you need water to live. So we just figure out a way to get these things done, not by pretending to have values different than they are, not by people like me, for example, pretending to be more conservative than we are, but by coming to the table in good faith, standing on our values, and negotiating our differences in an honest fashion. I also believe that the Midwest needs to produce more leaders at the highest level, especially within our party. You know, the idea that to speak for the Democratic Party you got to be a coastal member of Congress, I think misses so much of the heart and soul of the progressive tradition in this country, which is rooted in historical figures who have come from states like yours and states like mine. And I think we need Midwestern faces to help reconnect our party with the middle of the country. Again, not, in my view, by pretending to be something that we're not, but rather by asserting why, for communities like ours who have been sold on this idea somehow that the way to our hearts is resentment, that the only formula that will speak to us is to promise to turn back the clock, that we in fact are not afraid to change, that we're prepared for change, but that we also have some tough questions to ask of ourselves and our leaders about how to make sure that those changes actually work for us and make us better off. South Bend's story is a great example. We were written off, literally written about as a dying city at the beginning of this decade. We were an auto town. We lost a quarter of our people when the auto factories left. And yet, we have been able to grow, to change our future, to attract investment, to rebuild our downtown, to save our neighborhoods. And I can tell you it was not by me beating my chest, going around saying that I alone can fix it. It was by being honest. And an honest politics cannot be one that revolves around the word again. That is a disservice to communities like ours, where people, generations of people, grow up as I did, inhaling this message that the only way to succeed is to get out. When actually so many people like me have found purpose in being part of a return home, and we've actually had a brain game of people who are excited about our communities coming back. So why not a mayor? Why not somebody from the Midwest? And why not somebody from a different generation? I belong to the generation that experienced school shootings. I was in high school when Columbine happened. I belong to the generation that is going to be paying the bills for the unaffordable tax cuts for the wealthiest that were passed by the most recent Congress. We're the generation that provided most of the troops in the conflicts after 9/11, including myself. And we are the generation that will be dealing with the impacts of climate change for as long as we're alive. We're also economically a generation that stands to be the first in American history to be worse off than our parents unless we change something about the trajectory of this country. So why wouldn't we put forward leaders from this generation? I would argue that Congress is getting better since we sent some extraordinary leaders, mostly women, from a new generation to Washington to start this year. And I think we need those voices at our highest levels in national politics too. So I get the audacity of someone my age entering this conversation. Frankly, there's a pretty high degree of audacity to any mortal thinking that they can belong in that office. And I think that if you contemplate the demands of that office, it is more than anything humbling. And yet, 45 people have walked into that office with the experience they had and the ideas that they had and the people they surrounded themselves with. And some have done better than others, to put it mildly. And that's where the message becomes really important. And again, I believe that a Midwestern millennial mayor, in particular somebody from our part of the country, can offer a different kind of vocabulary and a different message about what it's going to take to move our country forward. My entry in the bumper sticker competition, if you will, is 3 words. You know, everybody says Democrats, we're too nuanced, we're too complicated, we can't put what we believe on a bumper sticker. So here's my bumper sticker. It's freedom, democracy, and security. And I get that each one of those on its own just sounds like one of those words. Like nobody can be against freedom, democracy, and security. But I also am out to make the case that if you take those ideas seriously, they lead you in a specific direction, and that direction is best answered for on our side of the aisle. That if we're serious about freedom, we need to take that vocabulary back from folks on the other side of the aisle who understand freedom in a very narrow and very specific sense. And that's freedom from. Freedom from government, freedom from regulation, freedom from taxes, as if you can get something for nothing. But it's only freedom from. And I'm concerned with the policies that get us freedom to live a life of our choosing. I think healthcare is freedom, because I don't think you're free if you can't start a small business because you're afraid moving jobs means losing your healthcare. I believe that you're not free if your reproductive health choices are dictated by male bosses and politicians who don't even know. I don't see how you can be free if you are being prevented by your own state house from being able to organize for a fair day's wage for a fair day's work. Freedom in my life hasn't been about freedom to pollute something. It's been about freedom to choose my spouse, who's right here, by the way. There he is. He's a teacher, so I married up. And that unbelievably important thing, the most important thing in my life, exists by the grace of a single vote on the U.S. Supreme Court. So that's what freedom means to me. I think we got to, speaking of the court, talk about democracy. And talk about democracy at a deeper level than we've been willing to. Yes, we've got to do something about money in politics, even if it means a constitutional solution to end Citizens United. Yes, we've got to do something about redistricting, because we can't go on with politicians choosing their voters instead of the other way around. Let's also talk about whether we're truly a democratic country if the Electoral College can overrule the American people twice in my short lifetime. Let's talk about what kind of democracy it is if the highest court in the land is on a fast, slippery slope toward being viewed as a nakedly political institution. And if fixing that means entertaining structural solutions to depoliticize the court, then let's have an adult conversation about that. Because I'm not old enough to remember when Birch Bayh from the state of Indiana was authoring constitutional amendments in the 70s. But I can tell you that that wasn't that long ago. So we shouldn't be afraid. You know, that period of constitutional work brought us 18-year-olds being able to vote. It brought us the 25th Amendment. It very nearly brought us the Equal Rights Amendment. It's a shame we haven't been able to do that yet. And so why not look at those solutions that are going to make this a better country to live in for the next, not just for the next election, but for the next generation and for the era that is opening up today, which is simply not going to be like the last 30 or 40 years. That's what it means to me to talk about democracy. And the other side's not interested. And third, but certainly not least in importance, security. And I'm not just talking about border security, and I'm not just talking about security in the military like what I worked on professionally, which had to do with counterterrorism. But I'm talking about 21st century security issues that the other side would prepare not to talk about at all. When we really think about what it means to take cybersecurity seriously, and you cannot deal with a cyber threat by putting up a wall from sea to shining sea. You can't deal with election security issues with traditional 20th century tactics. And you can't deal with climate security issues if you refuse to acknowledge that that's a security issue to begin with. I'm not going to come to Cedar Rapids and tell you about the importance of climate. And by the way, we've experienced things in our city too. I found myself activating the Emergency Operations Center of the City of South Bend twice in 18 months, once for a 500-year storm and once for a 1,000-year storm. So we can either talk about either I ought to head to the casino right now and check my statistical luck, or we've got some real security work to do. And we've got to take it that seriously. So that's what I think it means to have a 21st century message about freedom, democracy, and security. And I think it's time for a different kind of messenger. Somebody who can talk about the way the world is going to look in 2054, which is, God willing, when I would reach the current age of the current president, and talk about that not as somebody else's problem, but as a personal concern. And what excites me most about the faces and the people that I've met as I traveled this state, what excites me most about a room like this is the prospect of establishing a generational alliance that takes seriously what the future is going to look like, that cares about the future, that takes the future personally and is ready to make those choices. So that's what I'm up to. That's why I'm here, enjoying this. And I'd be happy to take a couple questions before we just get to visiting one-on-one. Yes?
In 2009, I lost my job at the university, and I started driving up to Minneapolis, right, which is a 4-hour drive, right, up during the week. You know, thought I would have to move up there. Luckily, after 20 months of doing that, I got a telecommute position, and I'm back home, and have been back for 7 years. But it's a problem with this sort of town, right? People want to live here because it's got a good quality of life.
Right.
You don't want to be stuck in traffic in Minneapolis. And yet, we need telecommuting, we need small satellite businesses, other sorts of ways to make this work, right? And you probably maybe have some experience in that with something.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, your story reminds me of home where, look, there are a lot of changes, and people are going to be changing jobs more and more often. But my generation is probably going to change careers more often than my parents changed job titles. And it's one of the reasons why, first of all, we've got to change the stakes of what happens when you have a job transition. It's why universal health care matters. It's why we've got to make sure we have portable benefits, that your world isn't completely upended when you're going through those transitions. And it's why, as you say, communities like ours need to have a diverse range of options to grow into and to grow around. Part of that's quality of life and quality of place. So one of the things I found was when I became mayor, I was under a lot of pressure to kind of buy jobs, to find some package that was going to lure the big plant to move over and fix all our problems. And what I realized pretty quickly was that the kind of plant that would come over if I was just trying to buy them was the kind of plant that would leave 7 years later when somebody else did the same thing. And so, don't get me wrong, we use economic incentives sometimes as a tiebreaker or to make something pencil out that can't quite get there. But we've got to make sure that that the fundamentals are there. And the fundamentals are things like infrastructure and education and safety. And we've got to build that up in a way that makes us all more resilient as these economic changes happen. We didn't walk away from our manufacturing past, but we recognize that it's not going to create jobs in the same patterns that it used to. And we've got to recognize that not everybody's going to turn around and become a computer coder in midlife. That's not how it works. And that shouldn't have to be. So until we have answers that make it possible for people to experience that kind of freedom, to know that you can stay in a community that you care about, even as the job market around you is changing. I think that's one of the biggest things we've got to be prepared for in the years ahead. It's what we tried hard to do in South Bend, and I think we've made a lot of progress there. So thanks for sharing the story. Thank you. Yes, on the stairwell.
I'm wondering, I appreciate your thoughts about Citizens United, and with the thought of money in politics beyond Citizens United, what are your thoughts about ways to return democracy to people like in this room and away from those who have the money to influence the process? And how do you intend to fund your own campaign?
Yeah, thanks for asking. Well, by the way, if anybody's in a generous mood, I'm really, since you asked, I'm really counting on those grassroots contributions because we've made the decision not to accept any corporate PAC money as part of this. But that's going to make it that much tougher because that's what the playbook tells you you're supposed to do. And, as long as money equals votes, as long as money equals power, then we're letting our democracy slip through our fingers. So I think a lot of the reforms that were proposed in H.R. 1 in the House are the right way to go. It's unlikely they'll even get a hearing in the Senate, which is too bad because most Americans believe in this, including a public financing system, including transparency requirements for super PACs, so that we can at least see what's going on in there. But the reality is, I think unless we can end Citizens United, there's always going to be ways that money will find its way, flow its way into our political life, and it makes it that much harder for people to make the right decision. So these are structural problems. By the way, also being warped a little bit by just some structural choices, because there's one party that's concluded that it's better for them if more people don't vote. So making it harder for people to vote, making it harder for people to register to vote, we've got to look at having Election Day be a holiday. We've got to look at more opportunities for early vote and vote by mail. And we've got to ask whether we're going to tolerate fellow U.S. citizens in places like Puerto Rico or D.C. being shut out of the political process when their problems are just the same as ours. That's part of what I mean when I talk about democracy. If we really want to call ourselves one, then we've got to back it up with reforms, even if some of those reforms are going to take some serious heavy lifting to get done. Thanks. Yes?
What are your thoughts on the potential of fusion energy to mitigate our problems with the weather and our future security in climate change?
So I don't have the scientific wherewithal to evaluate the amount of time it'll take humanity to put fusion to good use. But I also think you don't have to be a scientist to have a sense of immediate personal urgency around climate. And that's why, to me, the number one priority in our energy policy has to be carbon emissions. And within that, there are things we can do related to carbon standards for utilities, but also R&D to bend the cost curve on solar PV. Right now in South Bend, we're working with Habitat to set up zero net energy homes in low-income neighborhoods right now. And the reason this is important is that it's not just about our country's energy independence, it's about families' energy independence, and it benefits them economically too. And I think the more we can do on a distributed basis, it won't work everywhere, but the more we can do distributed, the better. But more directly to get to your question, I would say this. if you look at the Manhattan Project or the Apollo program that sent people to the moon, in inflation-adjusted dollars, those amounted to something like $10 billion a year in R&D. And we should be willing to deal with a world historical crisis whose dimensions are no less important than that of a depression or a war. We ought to be willing to put those kinds of resources into the kind of research that will bring us carbon-free power, be it wind, solar, fusion, or waves, or whatever else folks like me can't even get our little heads around. And for those who say, can we do it by 2040, can we do it by 2030? To me, the answer on the correct year to do it has been established by science and economics. And the answer on when to do it is yesterday. So it's just a matter of...
First of all, as a gay man, I'm really excited to have a gay candidate. It is refreshing to me. I'm tired of old white straight men being there. Here's my concern, and especially after last week with the United Methodist General Conference, and I say that, and I say this as a former United Methodist because I no longer am willing to allow myself to be affiliated with that group. How do we combat this? Because, the right wing and the evangelicals are going to hammer you. So,
Yeah.
What do we do?
Look, we got a long way to go, right? The president thinks he can gain by picking on trans people. Can you think of a more vulnerable person than a transgender student in high school? Just has to go to the bathroom like the rest of us. And, high school is a frightening and intimidating place when you're not transgender, let alone when you are. And so we've got to make sure that we're standing up for folks like that. We've got to have a Federal Equality Act so they can't be fired for being gay, which is still an issue around the country. But I'll tell you this much. Chesson and I had the opportunity to get married in our church, an Episcopal church, and it saddens me that not everybody can get there. When I came out, we didn't know what the politics were going to be like. I live in Indiana. Mike Pence was governor at the time. I just had to do it because I was ready to start dating and have a life. And it was the middle of a re-election year. And I just said, to hell with the politics, we're going to do this. And in the socially conservative community, I got reelected with 80% of the vote. And to go from when I got into elected politics, which obviously wasn't that long ago, that was the beginning of this decade, right, in 2010, when it was a given that you could either be a military officer or you could be out, but you could not be both. And it was, as far as I knew, a given that where I came from, you could either be in politics, you could be elected, or you could be out, but you could not be both. And so the fact that we're having a serious conversation about a presidential candidacy in this room right now with my husband, lovingly and or patiently looking on. It shows you what's possible. And if nothing else, I believe this makes it easier, that much easier for the next person to come along. Great question. Great message. Well, I think it's one of the most important things we can work on. What grade are you in right now? Third grade. All right. So, one of the things we count in order to know how this country is doing is how many students in third grade are doing okay at reading. And you might feel like that's about how you're doing, but really it's about how we're doing. How good of a job have we done in setting up a school system and teachers that are going to do right by you and help you learn? And so, frankly, I'm worried. I'm especially worried that some of our public schools don't get the resources that they need. And also our teachers. You want to guess who? I'm going to make a list of 5 different kinds of jobs. Mayor, doctor, bartender, union plumber, teacher. You know who makes the least amount of money on average out of those 5? Bartender? Nope. They usually make more money than a teacher. Depends on the bar and it depends on the school. But Chasten was sharing with Chasten's got a master's degree, and I'm pretty sure, didn't you tell me, babe, that you made more as a bartender years ago than you did as a teacher? My policy director is an economist. He did a landmark study that was on the cover of the New York Times where they took IRS data and they used it. Basically, they figured out how much of a difference it makes on how much money somebody will make over the course of their lives if they had a great teacher when they were a kid. And he found out that if you just based compensation off of that, the best teachers in kindergarten should be making something like $300,000 a year. That's more than they make. So we got to do something about treating teachers with respect and honoring them, not just with the paycheck that they deserve, but also with the respect that they deserve. And that's just one way we can show that we care about education. That's a great question. Thank you.
The homeless community here in Cedar Rapids, and we see a lot of persons in our community that struggle with mental health. They're too high functioning, or they don't have family that's there to help them, because the idea that just because you struggle with mental health or even spectrum-like disorders that you automatically have a mother or an aunt who's going to let you stay with them for the rest of your life because you're they get a disability check, some of them, and then they're kind of just set out into the world because they're too high functioning and they're adults. They don't have the criteria or mental capacity to be able to sustain shelter. Some of them don't believe they deserve shelter because they struggle so hard with mental health. And it's heartbreaking when we have to say there's really nothing aside from maybe daily shelters that sometimes are low barrier and they're at a disadvantage to be in a highly vulnerable people. Like, what can we do for those people who are often overlooked?
Yeah.
You know, because they are too high functioning to be in any kind of help, but not enough to.
Yeah, and I got a friend that I grew up with who's in exactly that situation. Luckily, right now, his family's been able to take care of him, but you know, he's my age, which means his mother's my parents' age, and they're wondering what they're going to do for the long term. There's a kind of tactical set of answers, and then there's a very big picture set of answers. So tactically, I mean, first of all, we do need things like permanent supportive housing for the hardest to house, and we have expanded the number of low barrier shelter beds in South Bend. We're not there yet. Not just shelter beds, but permanent supportive housing units. Because it makes sense. You know, the idea that you got to resolve everything that's affecting somebody before you put them indoors just doesn't add up for us right now. And we've got to have more resources that are targeted towards, by the way, some of it goes back to the education system, right? And special education resources. Now, the global thing I want to bring up is just culturally, we got to break the silence on some of these things.
Yeah.
It's starting to happen, but we got to destigmatize mental illness, destigmatize developmental disability, and treat them as seriously as we do physical health issues, right? We're having enough trouble getting that right. We got to make sure that we take seriously, I mean, mental health issues affect, well, several things that are very close to my heart, right? I mean, LGBT folks are affected disproportionately, veterans are affected disproportionately. And as a mayor who is really trying to deal with homelessness, it's obviously something that touches a large segment of the people who are experiencing homelessness. So, you know, compassionate support from people like you committed to working on that matters, but it's not fair to allow you to, or expect you to fix it when you don't have a policy environment that values and takes seriously these questions and enough resources going on the ground to make it easier for you to do your job. So thanks for what you're doing and thanks for the question. Probably two more, and then we'll visit until it's about time to wrap.
I was wondering what your stance is on like mega corporations, as far as like as a small business owner.
Yep.
Both of my small businesses are highly affected by like mega corporations, and wondered what your stance is on that.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that's making it tougher for mayors like me and cities like ours to have a thriving Main Street, right? And that's what so much of the life of our communities is about. I think a lot of it has to do with how we structure corporate governance. So is it just about maximizing global shareholder return? Or do we expect some social value to come out of these companies too? And by the way, a lot of the small businesses that I work with, they don't mind a chance to, they're happy to compete. Just want to compete on a fair playing field. And the real problem with the concentration of business and the concentration of wealth is that in our political system, partly because of the condition of our democracy, it turns into a concentration of power, right? Because they are able to, especially by the way at the state level, I mean even more than federal, it's amazing what they can get away with in just kind of bending that playing field and make it harder to get by. So everybody should have the right to compete, and that's big players and small players. But that means that policymakers have to make choices that keep that playing field level. And as long as we have money in politics playing the role that it does, I don't think that it's going to happen. And it's one of the reasons why we need to do that structural reform, or else our economy is just going to go the way of our democracy. Yes?
I have a two-part question. The first is, I think that our politics changed radically in the 80s when Reagan convinced so many people that the problem was the government and that the government couldn't do anything right. So I'd like to know how you would address that question. And second, which I think is related, what do you think the top tax rate should be for the wealthiest Americans?
Yeah. So let me take the second one first. I haven't done all the math yet because I don't know how much revenue I'm going to propose that we try to raise, but I'll tell you this. I think most of us get that the top marginal income tax rate probably needs to go up, that some people just aren't paying their share. And by the way, would be able to do so and be fine. And many of them didn't ask for this cut to begin with. But I would couple it with a wealth tax. We can quibble over the numbers, but it's not that different from property taxes. And if we got to choose between taxing work and taxing wealth, I'd rather be taxing wealth within reason. And also, there are a lot of folks getting. Look, you have to have some kind of financial sector, but there are a lot of folks getting preposterously wealthy off of millisecond-long differences that algorithms exploit in these transactions that it's not possible. I mean, I studied economics for quite a while, and I can't figure out where, if at all, you can find any concrete value that any of these transactions contribute to our economy. Maybe we ought to be taxing those. And so it's why I think it's a healthy time to have that financial transactions tax conversation. So we'll have to layer this and come up with the right package that allows the economy to continue growing but gathers the revenue we need. But what I know for sure is if we disinvest in education and infrastructure like we've been doing, then you're going to see this little discussed and extremely important American number in our economic statistics get worse. And that number is productivity growth. It used to be we could do all kinds of tax cuts or spending or whatever. We'd always grow our way out of it because productivity went up so much. That's slowing down, as you might expect when you cut research, cut education, and cut infrastructure. So if we're not dealing with that, if we're not funding that and investing in that, then I think we can expect to see more of the same. And I guess that's part of how I answer your first question. Let me mention a strategic thing and then a kind of philosophical thing. The strategic thing is, conservatives were really good at this. I mean, they didn't just try to win this election or win that policy battle. They decided to pull the entire country to the right, pull the whole country. So that while in the 50s you had Eisenhower building interstates and warning about the military-industrial complex, and in the 70s you had Richard Nixon talking about a negative income tax, by the 90s you had Democratic presidents doing Republican things. That's what victory looks like. And so on our side, we got to stop arguing over whether our policies are halfway to the other folks' policies or further away, and start talking about our values and convince people of the values. Because they convinced people the government was the problem. And then they managed to win not an election but an era. So how do we respond to that? To me, that's why it's so important for us to talk about our vision of freedom. And it's not about make government bigger or make government smaller. It's about the idea that good government can secure our freedom just as much as bad government can infringe on it. And often that means making investments together. It means asking you to pay something out so that it can be returned to you in the form of a safer, healthier, better more equitable country. And I think most of us, if we had confidence that that's what government could deliver, then most of us would be more than willing to pay into that the same way I can get folks to pay into keeping a fire department, police department, and pothole filling crew up in the city of South Bend. But that's how we got to shift the vocabulary. All right, last one, and then we'll wrap.
I am a board member for Planned Parenthood here in Iowa, and I'm very curious what you would do in the first 100 days in office, particularly for women, whether it be healthcare, ERA, you pick.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, we should reopen the conversation about the ERA. I think that, you know, now, maybe it's, I don't like the young guy and that sounds kind of retro, but it was a good idea then, it's a good idea now. I think that we need to talk about pay transparency. Just the transparency alone, I think will get you 3/4 of the way there, right? If employers have to report on the disparities. I think, I don't mean to characterize this as a women's issue only, but I do think that all Americans, especially women, are better off when we do paid family leave. And we introduced it in the city of South Bend for our employees because the state wouldn't let me impose it as a community standard, but at least we decided to lead by example. Needless to say, we need to get, frankly, male politicians like me out of reproductive health care decisions and have policy that reflects that. And maybe more than anything, we need to move toward a Supreme Court that doesn't, you know, accept the theft of Supreme Court seats, and where each vacancy doesn't turn into an apocalyptic ideological battle, where we can take partisanship out of it. Because less partisan courts tend to actually rule in more progressive ways over time. And there's some different strategies on how to do it, but I think we got to do it. So, oh, and one other thing. And I get that I'm a dude running for office. Look, we make better decisions when more women are in positions of power. Not just fairer decisions to women, just intrinsically better. My old employer did a survey, or consulting firm, we did a survey of boards of major companies. The ones that had better gender diversity were actually more profitable. Just made better decisions. So that's kind of how we run things in the mayor's office in South Bend. There are more women in senior positions of responsibility than not. It's definitely made us a better workplace, and obviously we would expect to see that be the case in a future White House too.
Thank you all for coming, and especially thank you to the Dublin City Pub for hosting us tonight. And I'm sure the mayor will be back, but I hope you get a chance to talk with him. And thank you once again. Thank you.
Hey, thanks a lot for having us.